When we think about feudalism, it is impossible not to return to the greatest transformation Europe ever experienced, the fall of the Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome built roads, strengthened cities, organized armies, spread laws, and centralized power in a structure that seemed unshakable. But from the 3rd century onward, this great mechanism began to fail. Internal wars, pressure from foreign peoples, economic crisis, and the difficulty of sustaining such a vast territory weakened the foundations of the empire. What had long ensured order and stability began to fragment, as if ancient stone columns were slowly cracking until they finally collapsed. The idea of a single and centralized power disappeared, leaving behind a land marked by uncertainty. When the legions could no longer protect the borders and emperors succeeded one another quickly, often murdered or deposed, Roman cities began to lose their luster. The currency lost value, trade diminished, and the urban population, deprived of security or resources, sought refuge in the countryside. The invasions of peoples such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns intensified this ruin, sacking cities, toppling walls, and breaking the ancient sense of protection that Rome had guaranteed for centuries. When, in the year 476 after Christ, the last Roman emperor of the West was deposed, the ancient world finally gave way to a new scenario. Without Rome, a vacuum of power emerged. The administration that once organized taxes, justice, and armies simply disappeared. Roads were no longer maintained, markets collapsed, and each region came to depend on its own ability to defend and survive. What had once been an interconnected network now dissolved into small, isolated communities, each seeking its own ways to guarantee protection against invaders, hunger, and misery. In this environment of collapse, the figure of an armed protector became more important than any memory of Roman glory. It was the beginning of a new era, no longer marked by cosmopolitan cities and imperial armies, but by small local lords, stone castles, and peasants bound to the land. With the fall of Rome, the European world plunged into an era of instability, marked by the arrival and advance of different peoples known as barbarians. This term, used by the Romans, served to designate all those who did not share their language, customs, and political organization. But beyond the label, each group had its own identity, traditions, and military strength. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi, Angles, Saxons, Franks, and later the FEUD Huns were the protagonists of a radical transformation. They not only pressed the borders of the former empire, but also occupied its lands, destroyed cities, and founded new kingdoms, paving the way for a mosaic of regional powers that would replace Roman centralization. These invasions did not occur all at once, but in successive waves between the 4th and 6th centuries. Each incursion further weakened Roman structures, spreading fear and uncertainty. The city of Rome, the ultimate symbol of imperial power, was sacked more than once, revealing to the world that there was no longer any authority capable of protecting the heart of the empire. Meanwhile, local populations, without a regular army or organized government, were forced to seek protection under the authority of warriors and tribal chiefs. The fragmentation of Europe was not only political, it was also social, cultural, and economic, as each region began to develop in isolation, creating its own traditions and decentralized systems of power. The result of this process was the birth of a ruralized Europe, made up of small kingdoms and territories, governed by local leaders who guaranteed defense in exchange for obedience and labor. Long-distance trade practically disappeared, the old Roman roads were abandoned, and urban life gave way to rural villages where survival was the priority. This fragmentation, initially chaotic and violent, became the fertile ground for the emergence of the feudal system, in which each community sought self-sufficiency and protection within reduced borders. The unity of the Roman Empire had dissolved forever, and in its place arose a Europe of multiple powers, each sustained by the strength of arms and dependence on the land. With the fragmentation of the former Roman world and the constant threat of invasions, long-distance trade went into decline, and cities lost their strength as centers of power and supply. In this scenario, the population began to seek safer and closer alternatives for survival. This was how self-sufficient rural communities arose, which would become the basis of feudalism. In these small units, families of peasants, serfs, and land workers produced almost everything they needed to live: food, clothing, tools, and even shelters. Self-sufficiency was not a choice, but a necessity imposed by the isolation and instability of a collapsing Europe. These communities revolved around arable land and were protected by local chiefs, often warriors who possessed small wooden or stone fortifications. The relationship between protectors and workers consolidated into a system of exchanges. In return for defense against external attacks and against hunger, peasants handed over part of their harvest and their labor. Little by little, this bond became permanent, creating dependence and reducing the freedom of rural families. What once could be seen as a temporary solution for times of crisis was transformed into a fixed social structure marked by obligation and hierarchy. These self-sufficient rural villages were also the stage for a cultural transformation. Without frequent contact with the outside world, each community developed its own customs, local religious traditions, and particular forms of organization. Life was regulated by the rhythm of the seasons, the harvest, and the obligations imposed by the lord of the land. The circulation of coins almost completely disappeared, and exchanges were made in kind: grains, animals, utensils, or labor. This isolation reinforced local power and dissolved even further any possibility of political centralization. Thus, at the heart of these small communities, the model that would define the entire Middle Ages was born, a system in which land, protection, and loyalty were the fundamental pillars of survival. As the European scenario became more violent and uncertain, rural life came to depend on the presence of armed men capable of offering security. Barbarian invasions, constant looting, and the absence of a strong central power made defense an absolute priority. In this context, a decisive alliance for the Middle Ages was formed. Warriors offered protection, while peasants guaranteed labor and food. This informal pact, born of necessity, became the foundation of the feudal system. What began as a pragmatic exchange of interests, weapons in exchange for harvests, was transformed into a rigid social structure that would endure for centuries. The functioning of this relationship was simple, but relentless. The warrior lord possessed land and weapons, and around him gathered peasants who sought refuge from the dangers of the outside world. These workers cultivated the soil, cared for animals, and sustained not only their families but also the lord and his retinue of warriors. In return, the protector offered security within the limits of the fief. Palisades, wooden walls, or stone castles were erected, and defense was organized against invaders. The survival of each group depended on the other. Without agricultural production, warriors would have no food. Without weapons and military strength, peasants would be looted and killed. Over time, this alliance ceased to be merely a relationship of convenience and consolidated into a social system based on permanent obligations. The peasant, who at first sought only shelter, ended up tied to the land, unable to leave it, since his survival and that of his family were linked to the lord who protected him. In the same way, the warrior came to depend on a stable base of production to maintain his power and his troops. From this fusion of interests was born the feudal pyramid, a hierarchy marked by dependence, fidelity, and duty, where each position had its clearly defined function. Thus, the alliance between warriors and peasants not only ensured survival in the post-Roman chaos, but also shaped the very foundation of medieval society. While warriors and peasants structured their lives around land and protection, one institution knew how to occupy the space left by the Roman collapse: the church. Unlike the fragmented kingdoms and the fragile alliances between local lords, the church offered something that transcended borders and uncertainties. It not only promised spiritual salvation, but also represented stability, order, and continuity in a world in ruins. Bishops and monks preserved writing, reading, and part of classical knowledge, while transmitting values of obedience, submission, and faith. Over time, the church became not only the spiritual guide of the Middle Ages, but also one of the greatest political and economic powers of the era. The power of the church was established on several levels. In villages, priests were mediators between the divine and the people, performing baptisms, marriages, and funerals, the central events of medieval life. In cities and kingdoms, bishops and archbishops accumulated spiritual authority and political influence, often rivaling kings themselves. Monasteries, scattered throughout Europe, became centers of agricultural production, manuscript copying, and cultural diffusion, acting as beacons of stability. Beyond the cultural aspect, the church was a massive landowner, which guaranteed it wealth and power comparable to the greatest feudal lords. Its ability to collect tithes and control consciences made it an indispensable force in any political negotiation. At the same time, the church offered a narrative that justified the very structure of feudalism. It taught that each man had his place in the world, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. This vision sustained social order and reinforced the acceptance of the system, showing that people's destiny was tied to divine will. Amid plagues, wars, and famine, the promise of eternal life was a powerful comfort, and few dared to challenge its authority. Thus, while Rome disappeared as an empire, the Church rose as the new axis of European civilization, uniting faith and power in the same invisible throne that would sustain centuries of spiritual and political dominance. With the consolidation of feudalism, the figure of the king, who should have symbolized the highest authority within a territory, became far more fragile than it appeared at first glance. Unlike Roman tradition, where the emperor concentrated power and administered vast regions through centralized laws and armies, in the Middle Ages, the king depended deeply on the loyalty of his vassals. His power was more symbolic than real, for each noble had his own soldiers, his own lands, and in many cases, his own justice. Royal authority was often contested, and many monarchs found themselves limited to the lands they directly controlled, unable to intervene effectively in the domains of their feudal lords. This fragility became even more evident in times of war or crisis. When the king needed troops, he did not possess them permanently as the old Roman army once had. Instead, he was forced to request military aid from his vassals, who decided when and how to respond to the call. Loyalty was based on oaths, but in practice it was often subject to personal interests. More powerful nobles could refuse to fight, conspire against the king, or even openly challenge his authority, creating internal disputes that further weakened centralization. This decentralization transformed royal power into a constant negotiation with the warrior aristocracy, in a game of alliances and rivalries that defined the fate of kingdoms. Despite these limitations, the king still played an essential role. He represented the symbolic unity of the realm, was seen as the protector of faith and the guardian of divine order. His coronation, often performed by the church, conferred a sacred character to his authority, reinforcing the idea that he ruled by the will of God. However, this sacredness was not enough to guarantee full obedience. Central power remained vulnerable, and the true strength of the Middle Ages was spread across countless castles, feudal lords, and private armies that shaped the political balance. Thus, at the heart of feudalism, the king was both the highest symbol of authority and the living proof of the fragility of centralized power. Within the feudal system, the true holders of power were the nobles, men and families who concentrated land, armies, and local influence. While the king symbolized distant and fragile unity, it was these lords who, in daily life, guaranteed protection, imposed their own laws, and administered the life of their regions. The warrior aristocracy formed a network of decentralized power, marked by alliances, rivalries, and vassalage pacts. The prestige of a noble came not only from wealth in harvests or land, but from his ability to gather knights, build castles, and impose himself by the strength of arms. Each fief was practically an autonomous world, and its authority was felt immediately by the serfs and peasants who lived under its shadow. The life of the nobility was marked by military training from an early age. Young men of aristocratic families were prepared for war, learning to ride horses, handle swords, lances, and bows, as well as mastering the art of strategy and chivalric honor. The ideal of knighthood was not only military but also cultural, tied to values such as courage, loyalty, and generosity, although in practice, violence and the pursuit of power were constant. Nobles did not hesitate to wage wars against neighbors to expand their lands, increase their income, or simply reaffirm their authority. This warlike mentality made medieval Europe a fragmented territory, frequently shaken by internal conflicts. Beyond warfare, nobles also exercised administrative and judicial functions within their domains. They were responsible for resolving disputes, applying punishments, and ensuring that peasants fulfilled their obligations of labor and taxes. At the same time, they built alliances through strategic marriages, reinforcing ties between powerful families and expanding their influence. This network of marriages and vassalage pacts sustained the aristocracy as a united elite, but also one that was deeply competitive. At the top of the feudal pyramid, these aristocratic warriors maintained not only the monopoly of force, but also control of the land, which was the true source of wealth and power in the Middle Ages. Within feudal society, the clergy occupied a prominent position and functioned as one of the pillars that supported medieval order. More than religious leaders, monks, priests, and bishops were authorities who influenced not only faith, but also politics, the economy, and social life. The Church, considered the most stable institution of the Middle Ages, possessed vast extensions of land, administered wealth, and acted as advisor to kings and nobles. The clergy, therefore, was a spiritual elite that legitimized feudal power, reinforced social hierarchy, and controlled the population through the promise of eternal salvation. Priests were the direct bridge between the people and the divine. In villages, they celebrated masses, performed baptisms, marriages, and funerals, marking all the important moments of peasant life. Bishops and archbishops, situated at a higher level, exercised political and administrative functions, influencing the decisions of entire kingdoms. They were often great landowners, comparable to the feudal lords themselves, and maintained a close connection with royal power. Monks, on the other hand, withdrawn in monasteries, devoted themselves to prayer, manuscript copying, and the preservation of knowledge, but were also fundamental to agricultural production and the economic organization of the regions where they lived. The strength of the clergy lay not only in the control of faith, but also in the ability to guide people's lives from birth to death. The threat of excommunication, for example, was feared even by the most powerful, since it meant exclusion from the Christian community and spiritual condemnation. The Church affirmed that each individual had a role defined by God, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. This doctrine reinforced social immobility and acceptance of the feudal system, since any attempt to question the established order was seen as sin. Thus, monks, priests, and bishops remained at the spiritual summit, but also as true architects of the social structure that defined the Middle Ages. If kings, nobles, and clerics concentrated power and prestige, it was the serfs and peasants who sustained the entire machinery of feudal society. Their lives were marked by hard work on the land, the payment of taxes, and obedience to the orders of the feudal lord. Unlike the slaves of antiquity, serfs were not the direct property of a lord, but they were legally bound to the land on which they lived. They could not leave it without authorization, and their freedom was severely limited by the obligations they had to fulfill. In this way, the survival of the entire feudal structure was supported by the daily effort of these men and women who made up the vast majority of the medieval population. The work of the serfs was divided between cultivating their small plots and fulfilling obligations on the domain, that is, the lands that belonged directly to the lord. In addition, there were fees and tributes paid in kind, grains, animals, produce from the fields, or even extra days of labor. They also had to use the mill, the oven, and other structures of the fief, paying fees known as banalities. Peasant life was harsh and marked by uncertainty. A poor harvest could mean hunger and debt, and diseases often devastated entire communities. Despite this, it was these workers who provided food not only for themselves, but for the nobility, the clergy, and the armies. Even under oppressive conditions, serfs and peasants preserved traditions, festivals, and popular beliefs that helped give meaning to their difficult lives. Many times they blended Christian rites with ancient customs, creating a form of religiosity that coexisted with the official faith preached by the Church. In the villages, relationships were built on proximity and dependence. Everyone knew the Lord, the priests, and the neighbors, living under the constant watch of the community. These men and women, invisible in the great political narratives, were in reality the true pillars of feudalism, for without their incessant work of planting, harvesting, and paying tributes, no castle would stand, no lord would maintain his weapons, and no kingdom would survive. At the heart of feudalism there was a bond that held society together, the ties of vassalage. These bonds were not simple agreements, but solemn commitments that involved loyalty, oaths before God, and reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals. Vassalage formed the foundation of the medieval hierarchy, establishing a network of dependency that united nobles of different levels of power. A vassal swore loyalty to a more powerful lord, committing himself to serve him in times of war, to give counsel, and to support his authority. In exchange, he received protection, lands to administer, and the prestige associated with being linked to a great name. This network of obligations created a true social web that sustained the political power of the Middle Ages. The ritual of the oath of vassalage was full of symbolism. The vassal knelt before the lord, placed his hands between the lord's hands, and promised absolute loyalty. This act was known as homage and sealed the vassal's submission. Then the lord granted the fief, usually a piece of land, as a sign of the alliance. This possession was not full ownership, but a right of use conditioned upon loyalty. If the vassal broke his oath, he could lose the land and even be considered a traitor. In this way, land became an instrument of power, distributed as a reward and withdrawn as punishment, which further strengthened the control of the feudal lords. But these bonds were not limited only to military obligations. The vassal was also required to attend the lord's assemblies, advise him on political matters, and provide economic support when necessary, financing military campaigns or contributing to ransoms in case of capture. This reciprocal, though unequal, relationship was essential for maintaining the cohesion of a fragmented society. Each oath reinforced the feudal pyramid, where every man had his defined place, and each bond strengthened the network of dependencies that maintained order. Thus, the ties of vassalage were not merely contracts, but the invisible cement that sustained the entire edifice of feudalism. The medieval castle was much more than a stone construction. It represented the heart of feudal power, the symbol of the lord's authority, and the guarantee of protection for all who lived around it. Built in strategic locations such as hills or riverbanks, the castle was designed to withstand sieges, attacks, and invasions. Its thick walls, watchtowers, and deep moats showed that power in the Middle Ages was closely tied to the ability to defend territories. For peasants, the castle was a refuge in times of war, a place to which they ran seeking shelter when invaders threatened fields and villages. But the castle was not only a military center. It also functioned as the administrative and economic hub of the fief. Within its walls, the lord exercised justice, collected tributes, managed agricultural production, and controlled the lives of his subjects. It was there that assemblies were held, where vassals swore oaths of loyalty and where alliances or conflicts were decided. In addition, the castle housed workshops, grain stores, barns, and even small chapels, becoming a self-sufficient space that concentrated wealth and power. This combination of military and administrative functions made the castle the central piece of the feudal machinery. The architectural grandeur of castles also had a psychological role. It constantly reminded everyone, serfs and travelers alike, who held power in that region. Every stone erected conveyed the idea of authority and stability, reinforcing the image of the lord as protector and leader. However, life inside castles was not only luxury or festivity, as popular culture often portrays. Although nobles enjoyed more comfort than peasants, the environment was cold, damp, and constantly prepared for war. Thus, the medieval castle was the materialization of feudal power, military fortress, administrative center, and permanent symbol of the hierarchy that defined the Middle Ages. Around the castles and seigneurial lands developed feudal villages, small clusters of simple houses made of wood, clay, and straw, where most of the medieval population lived. These villages were the center of peasant life and functioned as the link between agricultural work and the authority of the feudal lord. Routine was marked by the rhythm of the seasons and direct dependence on the land. Planting, harvesting, caring for animals, and storing food were constant activities. The day began at sunrise and ended with darkness, since access to lighting was scarce and expensive. The life of peasants was hard, with little space for leisure, but the community shared traditions, rituals, and festivities that helped bear the weight of existence. Within the villages, the economy was essentially one of subsistence. Each family cultivated what was necessary to survive, but part of the production was obligatorily destined for the feudal lord in the form of taxes or services. There were also small specialized activities, such as blacksmiths, millers, and carpenters, who met local needs. At occasional fairs, peasants could exchange products, but coin circulation was minimal. Work was hard and continuous, interrupted only by religious festivities or military obligations imposed by the lord. In addition, life was subject to constant risks. Harvests destroyed by pests, harsh winters, or external attacks could drive entire families into misery. Despite the difficulties, feudal villages were also spaces of strong community identity. Everyone knew one another, and cooperation was fundamental to facing adversity. The calendar of religious and agricultural festivals set the rhythm of life, offering moments of rest, music, dances, and traditions that reinforced social bonds. The church was always present, with a small chapel that centralized spiritual life and consolidated the idea that earthly suffering was temporary compared to the promise of salvation. Thus, the feudal village was the most authentic reflection of feudalism, simple, isolated, self-sufficient, and marked by the union of hard work, faith, and dependence on seigneurial authority. The organization of the fief reflected the very essence of the medieval system, and its foundation was the land. Within each feudal domain there was a fundamental division, the domain and the servile land. This separation determined not only the possession of the land, but also the destiny of labor, production, and the lives of peasant families. The domain was the portion of land reserved exclusively for the feudal lord. There, agricultural production was not destined for the peasants, but for sustaining the noble family, its soldiers, servants, and guests. The servile land, in turn, consisted of the plots of land granted to the serfs, where they cultivated their own food, but always under the condition of paying tributes and providing services to the lord. The functioning of this division guaranteed the maintenance of feudal hierarchy. On the domain, peasants were obliged to work part of their week without receiving anything in return, only for the right to remain tied to the land. This compulsory service was known as corvée. On the servile land, although peasants could harvest and consume the fruits of their labor, they had to hand over part of the production as tax, in addition to extra fees for using the lord's mill, oven, or barn. In this way, each harvest carried with it the mark of dependence. Even when a peasant achieved a good production, a significant part of it did not belong to him. The division between domain and servile land illustrates the unequal and oppressive character of feudalism. While the nobility enjoyed wealth and security within their castles, the serfs lived bound to obligations that prevented them from achieving full freedom. However, this system also guaranteed a certain stability. In exchange for their submission, peasants received protection against invaders and the possibility of living in an organized community. Thus the land, divided and controlled, was more than fertile soil. It was the instrument that defined the life, duties, and limits of each individual within feudal society. The life of serfs within feudalism was marked by a set of obligations that reinforced their dependence on the lord. These obligations were not occasional contributions, but permanent commitments that weighed upon each generation. Among them, three fundamental pillars stood out: the corvée, the tithe in kind, and the banalities. These duties organized the economy of the fief, secured the wealth of the lord, and maintained the social hierarchy intact. For peasants, they meant exhausting workdays, the constant loss of part of their production, and a routine of submission that limited their possibilities of social advancement. The corvée was the compulsory labor carried out on the lands of the domain. Without receiving anything in return, serfs dedicated entire days of their weeks to plowing, planting, and harvesting for the direct benefit of the feudal lord. This effort was essential to keep the castle supplied and ensure the survival of the nobility and its soldiers. The tithe in kind represented the handing over of a portion of the harvest from the servile land to the lord. Even while cultivating their own land, peasants knew that part of everything they produced, grains, wine, animals, or vegetables, was destined to replenish the lord's storerooms. This obligation meant that, even in years of poor harvest, the serfs still had to deliver products, running the risk of going hungry to fulfill their duty. The banalities, in turn, were fees charged for the use of structures belonging to the lord, such as the mill, the oven, and the wine press. No peasant could use them without paying. Thus, even the most basic activities of daily life, such as grinding grain to make bread, were under the lord's control. This set of obligations guaranteed the noble not only economic dominance, but also complete control over the lives of peasants. Although oppressive, these practices kept the feudal machinery functioning, ensuring the self-sufficiency of the fief. and reinforcing the idea that each man had his place defined by divine order. Despite the weight of obligations and the harshness of daily labor, the life of serfs and peasants was not made only of toil and suffering. The agricultural calendar, which marked the cycles of sowing and harvest, was also interwoven with festivals, rituals, and traditions that offered moments of pause, sociability, and collective joy. These celebrations had a dual role. They reinforced community cohesion and kept alive the connection between work on the land and Christian faith. Almost all festivities were linked to the religious calendar, and the church, ever present, transformed moments of rest into occasions of devotion and spiritual reaffirmation. At the beginning of spring, there were celebrations linked to the rebirth of nature, asking for blessings for the seeds sown into the soil. In summer and autumn, harvest festivals gathered the community in gratitude for the fruits obtained. Winter, a time of reduced agricultural activity, was the season of the longest festivities, marked by banquets, music, dances, and religious plays. In addition, the Christian calendar defined holy days, such as Easter and Christmas, which were lived intensely in each village, blending devotion with popular tradition. Many of these celebrations maintained ancient elements of pagan rites adapted to Christian faith, such as the use of bonfires, circular dances, and symbolic offerings. These celebrations had an essential practical and psychological function. They offered peasants the chance to rest, strengthen bonds of friendship, and forget, even if temporarily, the harshness of feudal life. They also reinforced collective identity, reminding everyone that survival depended on common effort and divine blessing. Thus, festivals, rituals, and traditions were not merely moments of leisure, but an integral part of the mechanism that sustained medieval order. They gave meaning to daily life, blending faith, work, and hope in a continuous cycle that marked the passage of time and the rhythm of existence. In feudal society, the church was not only a spiritual institution, it was also one of the greatest landowners in all of Europe, exercising a power that rivaled kings and feudal lords. This material wealth was added to its religious authority, making it a decisive force in the organization of the Middle Ages. Monasteries, cathedrals, and dioceses accumulated immense properties, receiving donations from nobles in exchange for spiritual blessings and also tithes paid by peasants. This network of possessions made the church an administrator of vast territories, with serfs, peasants, and even vassals who owed it loyalty in the same way as in any fief. The political power of the church was expressed in various dimensions. Popes, bishops, and abbots were frequently advisors to kings and directly influenced government decisions. In many cases, spiritual authority served to legitimize royal authority. A king anointed by the church was seen as governing by divine will, reinforcing the submission of his subjects. Furthermore, the church had coercive power through instruments such as excommunication and interdict, spiritual punishments that could paralyze the religious life of an entire community or isolate a ruler from his subjects. This power was so feared that even the most powerful nobles and kings submitted to the orders of the clergy. The accumulation of land and wealth also transformed the church into an economic force. Monasteries produced wine, oil, books, and even tools, actively participating in the material life of medieval society. Its influence extended beyond the walls of cathedrals and reached into the daily life of peasants, who saw it not only as a spiritual guide, but also as an authority with real power over their lives. Thus, the church consolidated itself as one of the greatest powers of the feudal world, uniting faith and power within the same structure. It was not only the refuge of souls, but also one of the most concrete pillars of the political and economic system that shaped the Middle Ages. Amid a fragmented Europe, marked by wars, invasions, and the loss of ancient Roman structures, monasteries emerged as true refuges of knowledge. Built in remote locations, often in isolated valleys or on protected hills, these religious spaces were not limited to prayer and monastic life. They played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge. It was within the stone walls of monasteries that manuscripts of antiquity were copied, translated, and safeguarded, ensuring that works of philosophy, science, history, and literature did not vanish into oblivion. Monks dedicated daily hours to reading and copying texts in scriptoria, silent rooms where writing was considered a sacred act. There, Each page was reproduced manually with extreme patience, illuminated by candles and decorated with ornate letters. This work, seemingly simple, kept alive the writings of thinkers such as Aristotle, Cicero, and St. Augustine, which would later nourish Europe's cultural flourishing. Beyond the classics, monasteries also produced records of medieval life itself: chronicles, letters, religious treatises, and even observations about agriculture and astronomy. In this way, they became centers of memory and culture in a time of great instability. But monasteries were not only guardians of the past, they were also hubs of economic production and practical innovation. Many developed advanced agricultural techniques, experimented with forms of irrigation, cultivated vineyards, and organized libraries that served as reference points for entire regions. This combination of spirituality, manual labor, and intellectual cultivation made monasteries points of stability in a chaotic world. Thus, in silence and prayer, monks saved centuries of knowledge and prepared the ground for the cultural rebirth that would mark the end of the Middle Ages. In the monasteries of the Middle Ages, monastic life followed strict rules designed to order time, discipline the body, and draw the spirit closer to God. Among all the norms that shaped the lives of monks, the most influential was the rule of Saint Benedict, created in the 6th century by the monk Benedict of Nursia. This set of guidelines organized daily routine around 3 fundamental pillars: prayer, work, and study. The idea was to keep monks away from the temptations of the outside world, leading them to a simple, disciplined life entirely dedicated to divine service. This rule, which soon spread throughout Europe, profoundly shaped the identity of medieval monasteries. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, every moment of the day was carefully divided. Collective prayer, known as the Divine Office, took place several times throughout the day, interrupting any manual or intellectual activity. Silence was valued as a form of concentration and devotion, while obedience to the abbot, the spiritual leader of the monastery, was absolute. Beyond prayers, monks dedicated themselves to physical work, farming, gardening, animal husbandry, as well as to the copying and reading of manuscripts, which were considered forms of praise to God. The balance between spirituality and labor was seen as the path to Christian perfection. This austere routine made monasteries not only religious centers, but also models of discipline and organization. The example of monastic life inspired surrounding communities, and many peasants regarded the monks as holy men who, through their dedication, interceded for the common good. At the same time, the model created by Saint Benedict helped consolidate monasteries as enduring institutions capable of withstanding time and crises. In this way, the rule of Saint Benedict not only shaped the daily lives of thousands of monks, but also left a profound mark on medieval culture itself, showing that work and faith united could sustain the human spirit amid the uncertainties of the feudal world. In the Middle Ages, the Church did not limit itself to guiding spiritual life. It also controlled morality and dictated the course of culture. Through sermons, rituals, and symbols, religion determined what was right or wrong, shaping behaviors and reinforcing social order. Christian faith was the lens through which people understood the world, from natural phenomena to collective misfortunes, such as wars, famine, or plagues. Everything was interpreted as part of a divine plan. This view reinforced submission and acceptance of earthly suffering, since the promised reward was eternal life. Thus, the Church acted as guardian not only of souls, but also of conduct and culture for the whole of medieval society. Religious teachings penetrated every aspect of life. Marriage, for example, was considered an indissoluble sacrament, and sexuality was rigidly regulated. Attitudes seen as sinful, from heresies to practices of witchcraft, were severely condemned, with punishments that could include social exclusion or even execution. Christian morality also defined the role of each group in society: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. This division, presented as God's will, naturalized inequalities and made it nearly impossible to question feudal hierarchy. Religion thus became an instrument of control that legitimized privileges and maintained the established order. In the cultural field, the Church was equally dominant. It dictated the themes of art, architecture, and literature. Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and liturgical songs were expressions of spiritual power, but also political messages that reinforced the centrality of faith. At the same time, Everything that strayed from official doctrine was repressed as heresy. The monopoly of education, maintained by monasteries and schools linked to the clergy, ensured that knowledge was transmitted within the limits of Christian faith. Thus, religion shaped not only thought, but also daily practices and the very creativity of medieval man. The result was a society in which morality and culture were interwoven under the authority of the Church, ensuring its supremacy over all aspects of life. In a time marked by wars, famine, diseases, and constant insecurity, the promise of eternal salvation offered by the Church became one of the most powerful tools of domination of the Middle Ages. Earthly life, brief and full of suffering, was presented as merely preparation for the true destiny of the soul, paradise. This view gave meaning to the difficult daily life of peasants and justified the acceptance of their social condition. At the same time, it reinforced the authority of the Church and of feudal lords, who presented themselves as intermediaries of divine will. The hope of eternal life functioned as consolation, but also as a mechanism of control, since those who disobeyed the established order risked losing not only earthly protection, but also the promise of redemption. The power of this belief manifested itself in rituals and sacraments indispensable to spiritual life. Baptism, marriage, confession, and extreme unction were controlled by the Church, making the medieval man dependent on it from birth to death. The threat of excommunication, meaning exclusion from the Christian community, was feared by all, including kings and nobles, since it meant condemnation of the soul and the loss of social legitimacy. This ability to link political obedience to spiritual salvation gave the Church unparalleled power, which no other group in medieval society possessed. Thus, the promise of salvation, which for the faithful represented hope and consolation, also functioned for the Church as an instrument of maintaining order. By preaching that each man should accept his position as part of divine will, Christian faith legitimized feudal hierarchy. Serfs, nobles, and even kings were reminded that their actions would have eternal consequences, and obedience to earthly norms was transformed into the path to reach heavenly reward. In this way, religion not only guided spirituality, but shaped the entire social system, transforming salvation into a powerful tool of power and domination. At the heart of feudalism, agriculture was the true source of wealth and the foundation of all medieval society. Unlike the Roman Empire, where trade and cities held great importance, in the Middle Ages the economy was almost entirely focused on agricultural production. From the land came the food, the tributes, and the stability necessary for nobles and clergy to maintain their power. Serfs and peasants, tied to rural labor, were responsible for ensuring the survival of all other social groups, from the poorest to kings. The fertility of the soil and the organization of the agricultural calendar determined not only the sustenance of families, but also the strength of armies, the wealth of lords, and even the prosperity of churches and monasteries. The basis of this system was simple. Each fief needed to be self-sufficient. As commercial exchanges drastically declined after the fall of Rome, each community produced practically everything it consumed. Grains such as wheat, barley, and rye were cultivated on a large scale, while gardens and orchards provided vegetables and fruits. Animals such as oxen, pigs, goats, and chickens completed the diet, which was modest but essential for survival. Production did not serve only to feed peasants. A significant part was destined for the feudal lord, the church, and the warriors, ensuring the maintenance of hierarchy. However, medieval agriculture was vulnerable and dependent on climatic conditions. Harsh winters, droughts, or pests could ruin entire harvests, leading communities to famine. This constant risk reinforced the sense of dependence on divine protection and obligations toward the feudal lord. Even with its limitations, agriculture sustained not only the economy, but the entire feudal way of life. Power was not measured in coins or precious metals, but in the extent of arable land and the number of peasants able to work it. Thus, agriculture was not just a means of survival, it was the backbone of wealth and power in the Middle Ages. Although agriculture was the foundation of the feudal economy, the instruments available were relatively simple and rudimentary. Even so, the use of the plough, mills, and animal traction represented decisive advances for medieval productivity. The heavy iron plough, for example, made it possible to furrow the harder and wetter soils of Europe, increasing harvest yields. Its use, drawn by oxen or horses, reduced human effort and accelerated large-scale cultivation. With this, villages and fiefs could plant more land and ensure greater food security, even if they remained vulnerable to climatic variations and pests. Mills were another fundamental element of rural life. Powered by water or wind, they transformed grains into flour, one of the most essential foods of the medieval diet. In addition to saving labor, mills also represented a point of control for the feudal lord, since peasants were obliged to use them by paying the so-called banalities. Thus, even the technology that made daily life easier reinforced social hierarchy. The mill was not only a machine of production, it was a symbol of seigneurial power over the economic life of the community. Animal traction completed this set of innovations. Oxen and horses were not only used to plow the land, but also to transport loads, move presses, and help in heavy tasks. The development of more efficient harnesses for horses allowed for greater use of their strength, giving peasants increased production capacity. Although simple compared to modern technologies, these resources were essential to maintain the self-sufficiency of the fiefs. They showed how medieval life balanced between human effort, the force of nature, and the limited but effective ingenuity of its tools. Thus, the plough, the mill, and animal traction not only sustained the economy, but became symbols of ingenuity and survival at the heart of feudalism. One of the most striking features of feudalism was the self-sufficiency of the fiefs. Unlike the Roman world, where cities were interconnected by intense trade and currency circulation, the Middle Ages saw the economy restricted to the limits of the fief. Each community produced practically everything it needed: grains, vegetables, wine, meat, fabrics, and basic tools. The system was closed with little dependence on external exchanges, which guaranteed survival even in times of instability. This self-sufficiency, however, also limited economic development, as it inhibited the growth of broader markets and the circulation of monetary wealth. Currency, which in the past had been a central element of Mediterranean trade, almost disappeared from daily life. Instead of payments in money, barter prevailed. Peasants delivered part of their harvest as tribute to the lord, offered compulsory services, or paid fees with agricultural products. Even debts were settled with food, animals, or days of labor. Long-distance trade practically ceased to exist, and only luxury goods, such as spices and fine fabrics from the East, circulated in a limited way among the nobility and the clergy. For the majority of the population, coins were a rarity, and wealth was measured in land, harvests, and livestock. This self-sufficiency reinforced the political and economic fragmentation of the Middle Ages. Each fief was a small, almost independent unit, with its own resources, rules, and power relations. Isolation hindered innovation and the growth of trade, but it offered security in an unstable world. Only with the growth of cities, at the end of the Middle Ages, would this model begin to be overcome. Until then, the feudal economy remained marked by local production, the scarce use of coins, and survival guaranteed within the limits of the fief itself. Despite the self-sufficiency that characterized the fiefs, over time spaces of exchange began to emerge that partially broke the economic isolation of the Middle Ages. Fairs and markets became meeting points for peasants, artisans, merchants, and travelers, functioning as embryos of a commerce that would later transform Europe. On these occasions, surplus harvest products, fabrics, tools, and animals were exchanged or sold, often in small squares near churches or crossroads. For peasants, these gatherings represented a rare opportunity to obtain goods they could not produce in their villages, such as salt, metal utensils, or finer fabrics. As time passed, some fairs gained such importance that they became true regional trade centers. Merchants from distant lands brought spices, wine, furs, and even oriental products, arousing the interest of the nobility and the clergy. These fairs, often linked to religious dates or festivities, were also moments of sociability, where music, plays, and rituals reinforced the communal character of medieval life. At the same time, markets began to settle permanently in certain locations, giving rise to the rebirth of cities. Although still limited and dependent on the approval of feudal lords, fairs and markets represented a significant change. They reintroduced currency circulation, strengthened commercial ties between different regions, and paved the way for the growth of a new social class, the bourgeoisie. If at first they were only occasional gatherings, over time they became central elements of the European economy, responsible for slowly pulling society out of feudal isolation and moving it toward a more dynamic and interconnected world. Thus, fairs and markets were the first signs that the medieval economy was about to change. From the 11th century onward, Europe began to undergo a profound transformation, the rebirth of cities. After centuries in which urban life had almost disappeared, reduced to small villages and isolated communities, the growth of trade and fairs brought back the importance of urban areas. Burghs, small settlements that arose around markets, castles, or monasteries, were the embryos of this urban revival. Over time, these burghs expanded, attracting artisans, merchants, and peasants in search of new opportunities. Thus, a new landscape slowly emerged, a Europe in which cities once again played a prominent role. The urban resurgence was directly linked to the dynamism of trade. Merchants began to circulate more frequently, connecting different regions and reintroducing the circulation of money. Specialized artisans settled in the burghs, producing textiles, metal tools, footwear, and a wide variety of products that served not only the nobility, but also a new emerging social class, the bourgeoisie. This class, composed of merchants and artisans, began to gain economic power and little by little political influence, challenging the monopoly of nobles and clergy over social life. Beyond economic activity, medieval cities became spaces of cultural and social innovation. Surrounded by walls for protection, with narrow streets and crowded houses, they were places of intense coexistence, cultural exchanges, and circulation of ideas. Many obtained charters of privilege that guaranteed autonomy from feudal lords, allowing the creation of urban councils and new forms of local government. This urban renaissance not only transformed the economy, but also laid the foundations for profound changes in the medieval structure, preparing the way for the weakening of feudalism. Thus, burghs and cities were the first signs of a new world taking shape within the Middle Ages itself. In the feudal setting, knights represented the military force that sustained the authority of lords and the protection of fiefs. Mounted on trained horses, dressed in heavy armor and wielding swords or lances, they were the warrior elite of the Middle Ages. Becoming a knight was not only a matter of combat skill, it was also a symbol of status, prestige, and honor. From a young age, sons of nobles were prepared for this role, undergoing long training that included both military practice and education in values such as loyalty, discipline, and courage. The figure of the knight, immortalized in songs and legends, became one of the strongest symbols of medieval culture. The code of chivalry, even though often idealized, sought to regulate the conduct of these warriors. It preached loyalty to the feudal lord, defense of the Christian faith, and protection of the weak, especially women, orphans, and defenseless peasants. This ideal of honor, spread by troubadours and chroniclers, created the image of the knight as a noble hero guided by higher values. In practice, however, many knights acted with brutality, sacking enemy villages, exploiting peasants, and waging wars driven by ambition. Even so, the code of chivalry served as a cultural model, shaping the imagination of the time and reinforcing the connection between war, faith, and morality. Beyond the battlefield, knights participated in tournaments, jousts, and military exercises that demonstrated their skills and reinforced their prestige. These competitions, often held during festive occasions, were not only practical training, but also spectacles that entertained the nobility and the community. Religious devotion was also part of their identity. Many knights participated in the Crusades, combining the ideal of combat with a spiritual mission. Thus, knights and the code of chivalry symbolized the fusion of military life with religious and social values, becoming the highest expression of the warrior aristocracy of feudalism. In the Middle Ages, war was a constant presence, and the survival of nobles and knights depended directly on the quality of their weapons and armor. The development of this equipment transformed the medieval battlefield into a stage marked by the strength of iron and technical ingenuity. Armor, initially made of hardened leather and later of chainmail, evolved into the impressive plate armors that covered the entire body of the warrior. They offered protection against swords, lances, and arrows, making the knight an almost invincible figure when facing peasants and poorly equipped soldiers. Armor was not only a means of defense, it was also a symbol of status, since only nobles had the resources to acquire it. Weapons also reflected social hierarchy and the reality of feudalism. The sword was the emblem of the knight, carried as a sign of honor and prestige, while lances and shields formed the basic arsenal of battles. The bow and the crossbow, although less noble in prestige, were effective weapons used by common soldiers and supporting armies. Advances in forging techniques made it possible to create stronger and sharper blades, capable of piercing lighter armor. At the same time, catapults, siege towers, and battering rams were used in sieges, showing that medieval war was not only a duel of knights, but also a clash of collective strategies and war machines. The possession of weapons and armor reinforced the inequality between nobles and peasants. While the former protected themselves with metal and rode powerful mounts, the latter relied only on improvised tools and little protection. Thus, the military dominance of the nobility was sustained not only by social organization, but also by war technology. Armor and the sword, symbols of aristocratic power, showed that war in the Middle Ages was not only a struggle for survival, but also an expression of the social order that upheld the feudal pyramid. The Crusades were one of the most striking movements of the Middle Ages, uniting religion, war, and ambition in the same undertaking. Called by the Church from the end of the 11th century onward, these military expeditions had as their official objective the reconquest of the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, which was under Muslim control. The promise made to knights and participants was powerful. Those who fought in the Crusades would have their sins forgiven and assured eternal salvation. This union of faith and combat transformed the call of the Crusades into a phenomenon capable of mobilizing kings, nobles, knights, and even poor peasants toward the east. However, the Crusades were not only religious wars, they were also tied to political and economic interests. For many nobles, they represented the chance to conquer new lands, wealth, and prestige. For kings, it was a way to expand their influence and unite their kingdoms around a common cause. For merchants, especially those from Italian cities, lucrative trade routes with the East were opened, bringing spices, fine fabrics, and exotic products to Europe. Thus, behind the religious rhetoric, there was also a strong component of material ambition and power. The impact of the Crusades was profound. Although the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem on some occasions, the victories were temporary and followed by defeats. In the long run, the Crusades did not succeed in maintaining Christian control over the Holy Land. However, they left lasting marks. They reinforced the power of the Church, stimulated contact between different cultures, and opened the way for commercial growth that helped weaken feudal isolation. For the medieval mentality, the Crusades symbolized the fusion between sword and cross, showing how faith could be used to justify war and shape the destiny of Europe. In the Middle Ages, war was not limited to pitched battles between knights. One of the most common forms of conflict was the siege of castles, which could last for weeks, months, or even years. Castles, built in strategic positions and protected by thick walls and deep moats, were designed precisely to withstand these prolonged offensives. The goal of the siege was simple: isolate the defenders, cut off the supply of food and water, and force them into surrender through hunger and exhaustion. For this reason, more than direct combat, sieges represented the slower but also more devastating face of medieval warfare. To break through these defenses, attackers developed ingenious assault techniques. Wooden towers, known as siege towers, allowed soldiers to approach the tops of walls. Battering rams, large logs reinforced with metal, were used to smash and destroy gates. Catapults and trebuchets launched massive stones, incendiary projectiles, and even carcasses of decomposing animals, spreading terror and disease among the besieged. In some cases, invaders dug tunnels beneath the walls to collapse them, in a practice called mining. Each castle required a specific strategy, and the creativity of the attackers clashed with the ingenuity of the defenders. Inside the walls, resistance also had its cruel side. The besieged reinforced gates, built barricades, used arrows and boiling oil against enemies, and relied on the loyalty of the local population to resist. Suffering was intense. As days passed, food and water shortages led to despair. Many times, surrender was not merely a military choice but a necessity for survival. Sieges, therefore, showed that medieval warfare was far less heroic than the legends of knights suggested. They were clashes of patience, ingenuity, and brutality, reflecting the harsh reality of feudal life in times of conflict. For the medieval nobility, war was not an exception, but an integral part of daily life. From youth, sons of noble families were prepared for combat, trained in the art of chivalry, in handling weapons and in military discipline. A noble's identity was deeply tied to his ability to fight and defend his fief. Castles, private armies, and vassalage alliances were tools that guaranteed not only security, but also prestige and authority. In this context, war was understood as a natural extension of power, a way to resolve disputes, expand territories, and consolidate influence. Conflicts were not limited to large campaigns, but were part of regional life. Disputes over land between neighbors, hereditary rivalries, peasant uprisings, and even disagreements between vassals and lords were often resolved by force of arms. These local wars, though smaller than the Great Crusades, were constant and shaped the daily life of the warrior aristocracy. To participate in battles, lead sieges, and protect borders was an obligation that defined a noble's position within the feudal pyramid. The prestige of a family depended directly on its military tradition and its ability to remain undefeated before enemies. At the same time, war offered opportunities for enrichment and social advancement. Looting, conquest of lands, and the capture of prisoners for ransom were common practices, turning the battlefield into a space for profit. This mentality made violence a constant, reinforcing the idea that the Middle Ages was a time when power was asserted by the sword. Thus, for nobles, war was both a duty and a privilege, sustaining their social and political position. At the heart of feudalism, the daily life of the nobility was marked by the certainty that, in times of peace or conflict, domination could only be maintained through arms. In feudal society, access to knowledge was deeply marked by social inequality. Education was an almost exclusive privilege of the nobility and the clergy, while the vast majority of the population, made up of serfs and peasants, remained illiterate. For nobles, learning to read, write, and above all, mastering the art of war was part of the formation of their identity. The sons of the aristocracy were instructed from an early age in castles or monasteries, receiving religious teachings, lessons in Latin, and military training. This education reinforced their role as political leaders and warriors, preparing them to govern lands and command armies. For serfs and peasants, however, the reality was completely different. Bound to the hard work of the land, they had neither the time, resources, nor opportunities to learn to read or write. Their education was practical, passed down from generation to generation, planting, harvesting, raising animals, building simple houses, and obeying the rules imposed by the feudal lord. Knowledge was directly linked to survival, and the transmission of learning took place orally, through stories, traditions, and customs. Widespread illiteracy reinforced dependence on the clergy and the nobility, who held the monopoly of writing and literate culture. This contrast between the education of nobles and the illiteracy of serfs revealed how the feudal system worked. Hierarchy was sustained not only by military force or land ownership, but also by control of knowledge. Reading and writing were seen as tools of power, capable of recording laws, managing fiefs, and preserving memory. While the elite benefited from this privilege, peasants remained excluded, reinforcing the social distance that defined the Middle Ages. Thus, medieval education reflected the very structure of feudalism, unequal, rigid, and deeply marked by the division between those who governed and those who merely worked. In the Middle Ages, literature played an essential role in preserving collective memory and shaping the cultural identity of feudal societies. Among the most remarkable forms of expression were the chansons de geste, long epic poems that narrated the heroic deeds of knights and warriors, transmitting values such as courage, honor, and loyalty. These works were recited or sung by minstrels in squares, castles, and fairs, bringing stories of battles and conquests to an audience that, for the most part, could not read. The most famous example is the Song of Roland, which exalts the bravery of Christian knights fighting against Muslim enemies. These accounts mixed historical facts with legendary elements, serving both to entertain and to reinforce religious and warrior ideals. At the same time, troubadours and troubadour poetry flourished, especially from the 12th century onward. These poets and musicians traveled through courts and castles, singing verses about love, devotion, and noble life. The so-called courtly poetry idealized the relationship between knights and ladies, celebrating loyalty and impossible love, often in a melancholic and symbolic tone. This literary tradition helped shape the romantic vision of the Middle Ages, creating a contrast with the harshness of peasant life and the brutality of war. Medieval literature was, therefore, a reflection of feudal society, epic and warlike to exalt the nobility, but also lyrical and delicate to express the feelings and values of the aristocracy. It not only entertained but also educated, transmitting models of behavior and consolidating the medieval worldview. Even in a time of widespread illiteracy, the power of spoken and sung word made literature one of the cultural pillars of feudalism, perpetuating stories and ideals that still echo in the contemporary imagination. From the 12th century onward, Europe witnessed the flourishing of one of the most striking artistic expressions of the Middle Ages, Gothic art. Characterized by its grandeur, verticality, and detail, it manifested mainly in the architecture of cathedrals, which became symbols of both spiritual and political power. Unlike Romanesque churches, which had a heavier and darker appearance, Gothic cathedrals sought to lift the eyes of the faithful toward the heavens, conveying the idea of closeness to the divine. Their slender towers, pointed arches, and colorful stained glass windows filled the interiors with light, creating an atmosphere of reverence and transcendence that impressed all who entered their portals. These monumental constructions required vast material and human resources. Peasants, artisans, masons, and sculptors worked for decades, and often even centuries, to raise a single cathedral. The investment came from the church, nobles, and donations from the community, which saw the work as a way of demonstrating faith and devotion. Beyond being a religious space, the cathedral functioned as a social, political, and cultural center for the growing cities. It was there that celebrations, meetings of authorities, and public gatherings took place, making it the true heart of urban life. The stained glass sculptures and paintings of cathedrals did not serve merely an aesthetic function, but also an educational one. In a society marked by illiteracy, these images acted as a Bible of stone and glass, teaching episodes from the life of Christ, stories of saints, and moral messages through visual symbols. Every detail, from the gargoyles on the facades to the colorful rose windows, conveyed spiritual meanings and reminded the faithful of the constant presence of God. Thus, Gothic art and cathedrals were not just architectural works. They were testimonies of a time when faith, power, and culture were united in stone, glass, and light to shape the medieval imagination. In the Middle Ages, social life was deeply tied to the religious calendar. Religious feasts, celebrated in honor of saints, liturgical dates, or Christian events, were moments of pause in the harsh routine of agricultural work. On these occasions, communities gathered in processions, solemn masses, banquets, and dances, creating an atmosphere of devotion but also of collective joy. Christmas, Easter, All Saints' Day, and other dates marked the rhythm of the year, reinforcing faith and the presence of the church in daily life. These feasts were not only spiritual manifestations, they were also events that strengthened community bonds and provided moments of social interaction that eased the hardships of feudal life. At the same time, fairs became important social and economic gatherings. Often linked to religious celebrations, they brought together peasants, artisans, and merchants in spaces of exchange and interaction. In these fairs, not only goods were traded, but also stories, music, news, and traditions circulated, creating an environment of intense sociability. For many peasants, it was the only opportunity to meet people from other fiefs, experience novelties, and integrate into a broader world. For merchants, fairs were strategic occasions to expand businesses, form alliances, and consolidate trade routes. These events, both religious and commercial, played a fundamental cultural role. They were occasions when daily life gained color and intensity, contrasting with the monotony of agricultural labor. In feasts and fairs, the music of troubadours, popular theater performances, and skill competitions created memories that marked communities. Thus, religious celebrations and fairs were not merely moments of rest or trade, but living expressions of medieval identity, in which faith, culture, and social life were inseparably intertwined. In the Middle Ages, in a world marked by insecurity, the harshness of work, and the constant threat of disease, famine, and wars, superstitions and popular beliefs played a central role in community life. Christian faith guided the official worldview of society, but at the same time, ancient practices survived, remnants of pagan traditions that blended into the daily life of peasants. Amulets, prayers, signs from nature, and simple rituals were seen as forms of protection against misfortune. For many, the flight of a bird, the shape of clouds, or the cycle of the moon carried hidden messages capable of predicting harvests or announcing disasters. These popular beliefs often coexisted in tension with church doctrine. While the clergy condemned practices of witchcraft and magic as sin and heresy, the population saw in these traditions practical resources for dealing with everyday uncertainties. Healers, both men and women for example, used medicinal herbs, prayers and charms to treat illnesses, being both respected and feared within their communities. The use of sacred objects, such as relics of saints, also intertwined with these beliefs, creating a spiritual universe where the sacred and the magical walked side by side. These superstitions were not merely expressions of fear or ignorance. They reinforced a sense of belonging and offered explanations in a world where science was still in its infancy. Popular beliefs helped ease anxiety in the face of the unpredictable, providing symbolic tools for interpreting events. Thus, superstitions and folk traditions, even when fought by the church, remained alive at the heart of medieval villages, showing that the culture of the Middle Ages was made not only of cathedrals and manuscripts, but also of the simple imagination and daily spirituality of the people. In the feudal economy, which was deeply dependent on agriculture, famine was a constant threat that could devastate entire villages. Harvests were subject to countless uncontrollable factors. Prolonged droughts, harsh winters, floods, insect plagues, and crop diseases could compromise the entire sustenance of a community. Since agricultural production was limited and technology was rudimentary, any natural imbalance quickly turned into a food crisis. When harvests failed, famine spread, first striking the poorest peasants and then weakening the entire feudal system. These poor harvests were not isolated events, but recurring phenomena that marked the Middle Ages. During the so-called Little Ice Age, for example, the climate became colder and more unstable, reducing field productivity. In such times, grain shortages drove prices up, and many peasant families could not secure even the minimum for survival. Famine paved the way for disease, as weakened bodies became more vulnerable to epidemics. In many regions, accounts describe granary raids, peasant revolts, and desperate migrations in search of food. For feudal lords and for the church, famine was a challenge, but also an instrument of control. Many interpreted these periods as divine punishment, reinforcing the idea that it was necessary to obey authorities and seek forgiveness through faith. At the same time, the distribution of grain or alms during critical moments was used as a demonstration of power and benevolence. Famine, therefore, was not only a natural tragedy, it was an integral part of the social dynamic, constantly reminding people of the fragility of medieval life. It showed that, in a society so dependent on the land, survival was always at the mercy of nature and of the established order. In the 14th century, Europe was struck by one of the greatest catastrophes in its history, the Black Death. This devastating epidemic, caused by a bacterium transmitted by rat fleas, spread rapidly along trade routes and urban centers, wiping out entire populations. Within just a few years, it is estimated that 1/3 of Europe's population had succumbed to the disease, irreversibly altering the social, economic, and cultural structures of the Middle Ages. The symptoms were brutal: high fever, chills, vomiting, and the dreaded dark buboes that gave the plague its name. Death came within days, and terror spread as fast as the illness itself. The epidemic hit a society already weakened by wars and famine, intensifying its collapse. Entire villages were abandoned, cities lost a large part of their inhabitants, and agricultural production plummeted. With fewer workers available, fields lay empty, and the feudal economy fell into crisis. The shortage of labor gave surviving peasants some bargaining power, undermining the authority of feudal lords. At the same time, mass mortality had a profound psychological impact, fueling fear, despair, and the belief that the tragedy was divine punishment. The church, which was expected to provide spiritual comfort, saw its authority questioned. Many clerics died while caring for the sick, and the inability of faith to halt the plague shook people's confidence. Seeking explanations, persecutions arose against minorities who were unjustly accused of spreading the disease. The terror of the Black Death left marks that endured for generations, changing people's relationship with life, death, and authority. More than just an epidemic, it was a watershed that shook the foundations of feudalism and paved the way for the transformations that would lead to the end of the Middle Ages. The devastation caused by famine and the Black Death deeply weakened the structure of feudalism and opened space for a phenomenon that would change the relationship between lords and peasants, peasant revolts. With a large part of the population dead, labor became scarce, and surviving peasants began demanding better working conditions, reduced taxes, and greater freedom. In many regions, feudal lords tried to react by imposing even stricter obligations, but the pressure was so great that entire communities rebelled against their lords. These revolts, though violently suppressed in most cases, revealed that the foundations of the feudal system were no longer as solid as before. Peasant uprisings emerged in different parts of Europe. In some cases, villages united to refuse tax payments. In others, armed groups attacked castles, burned debt records, and demanded the end of feudal obligations. The most famous example was the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, when thousands of rural workers marched to London to protest against abusive taxes and demanded profound social changes. Although defeated, they made it clear that the nobility could no longer rule without taking into account the growing discontent of the rural population. These revolts, even when crushed, had a lasting impact. They showed that peasants no longer accepted feudal impositions passively, and that the labor shortage gave them unprecedented strength. In many places, lords were forced to grant concessions, reduce taxes, and accept more flexible work contracts. Thus, the peasant revolts not only undermined the authority of the nobility, but also accelerated the crisis of feudalism, pointing to a future in which serfdom would no longer be the foundation of European society. As feudalism entered into crisis, a new social class began to gain prominence, the bourgeoisie. Formed by merchants, artisans, and traders who lived in the boroughs and growing cities, this class stood out for its economic dynamism and its ability to generate wealth outside the feudal logic based on land. Trade, stimulated by fairs, land routes, and later by maritime connections, brought products from different regions and reintroduced the consistent use of currency. With this, the bourgeoisie became a driving force of social transformation, gradually altering the balance of power within medieval Europe. The strengthening of trade gave rise to guilds, associations of artisans that regulated prices, product quality, and the training of apprentices. These guilds ensured economic stability and elevated the prestige of urban workers. At the same time, merchants grew wealthy by importing spices, fine fabrics, and precious metals, increasingly linking the European continent to long-distance routes, especially those connecting the East and the Mediterranean. This commercial expansion fueled the growth of cities, which became centers of innovation and new forms of political organization. The power of the bourgeoisie also began to be reflected in politics. Many cities gained charters of autonomy, ensuring freedom from feudal lords. In exchange for taxes and financial support, kings began to ally with the bourgeoisie, using their resources to strengthen armies and consolidate central power. This alliance further weakened the feudal nobility, whose territorial power declined in the face of the rise of an urban and monetary economy. Thus, the bourgeoisie and commerce not only revitalized Europe, but were also decisive elements for the decline of feudalism and the transition to a new era. With the strengthening of the bourgeoisie, the growth of cities, and the transformation of trade, the feudal nobility began to lose the central role it had sustained for centuries. The nobles' power was tied to land ownership and the labor of serfs, but this model showed clear signs of wear. The reduction of the workforce after the Black Death, combined with peasant revolts and the increasing importance of currency, weakened the nobility's ability to maintain absolute control over the rural population. Many lords, under pressure, had to relax obligations, accept fairer work contracts, and allow former serfs to gain greater freedom. This process represented a profound shake in the foundations of feudalism. Serfdom, once seen as natural and inevitable, began to give way to new forms of economic relations. Peasants began renting land in exchange for payments in money or goods, rather than through compulsory services. In urbanized regions, many abandoned the countryside and migrated to the cities in search of opportunities with the bourgeoisie, further reducing dependence on the nobility. Thus, the rigidity of the feudal pyramid began to dissolve, giving space to a social mobility that was once unthinkable. For the nobility, accustomed to exercising absolute military and economic dominance, this change was a direct threat. Their castles lost importance with the advance of firearms, their authority was challenged by the rural population, and their political relevance was diminished by alliances between kings and the bourgeoisie. Gradually, the nobles ceased to be the central axis of European society, giving way to new social and economic forces. The weakening of the nobility and the decline of serfdom marked the beginning of the end of feudalism, preparing Europe for the transition toward centralized kingdoms and a world shaped by commerce, currency, and maritime expansion. As feudalism entered into crisis, a new political movement began to gain strength, the centralization of kingdoms under the authority of monarchies. For centuries, the power of kings had been fragmented and limited by the influence of the nobility, but with the decline of serfdom and the weakening of feudal lords, monarchs found room to consolidate their rule. This process was encouraged by alliances with the emerging bourgeoisie, who saw in the kings an opportunity to guarantee stability and protection for trade. In exchange for taxes and financial support, monarchs strengthened their armies and expanded their control over territories, reducing the autonomy of nobles. Centralization brought with it a new logic of government. Cities that had once been nearly independent were now subjected to royal power, local laws were replaced by unified legislation, and royal courts began to judge disputes that had previously remained in the hands of feudal lords. Permanent armies, financed by taxes, reduced the king's dependence on troops provided by vassals, breaking one of the foundations of the feudal pyramid. At the same time, symbols of power, such as solemn coronations performed by the church, reinforced the image of monarchs as representatives of order and divine will. This strengthening of monarchies transformed the political balance of Europe. While nobles lost autonomy, kings became central figures, capable of projecting power beyond their borders. This centralization paved the way for the great kingdoms that would define the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern age. More than mere rulers, monarchs came to be seen as pillars of national unity, supported by the bourgeoisie by the use of currency and by the advancement of administrative structures. Thus, the rise of monarchies was both a consequence and a catalyst for the decline of feudalism, inaugurating a new era of centralization and expansion. For centuries, castles had been symbols of power and security, built with thick walls and imposing towers capable of resisting prolonged sieges. However, the introduction of gunpowder and firearms into the European landscape, starting at the end of the Middle Ages, radically transformed the art of war and shook the foundations of feudalism. Heavy cannons, capable of launching projectiles against walls, rendered useless many of the defenses that had protected feudal lords for generations. A single artillery shot could open breaches in fortifications that had once resisted months of siege, forever changing the relationship between attack and defense. This military revolution directly weakened the feudal nobility. If before the power of a lord was measured by the strength of his castle and the number of knights he could summon, now power depended on the ability to finance armies equipped with firearms and cannons. Since these technologies were expensive, kings, supported by the bourgeoisie and the growth of cities, became the main beneficiaries of this change. The centralization of monarchical power was strengthened, while many local lords saw their fortresses become obsolete in the face of the new art of war. Gunpowder, therefore, was not only a military innovation, it was also a political and social factor of great impact. By reducing the importance of castles and heavy cavalry, it accelerated the decline of feudalism and paved the way for the rise of more centralized and modern states. The sound of cannons echoed not only on battlefields, but also as a signal of the end of an era in which walls and vassals had sustained power. With firearms, the Middle Ages moved toward its twilight, and a new military and political order took shape in Europe. With the weakening of feudalism and the rise of centralized monarchies, Europe entered a new phase of expansion and economic transformation, the era of the Great Navigations. Starting in the 15th century, Driven by the search for alternative routes for the trade of spices, gold, and other luxury products, European kingdoms launched themselves into the sea on expeditions that would forever change history. This maritime expansion was made possible thanks to advances in navigation techniques, the use of new instruments such as the compass and the astrolabe, and the construction of more resistant ships like the caravel. The ocean, once seen as a barrier, was transformed into a path toward wealth and conquest. This movement inaugurated what many historians call commercial capitalism. Unlike the subsistence economy typical of feudalism, the new system was based on the accumulation of wealth through international trade. Port cities flourished, merchants grew rich, transporting goods, and currency circulated with unprecedented intensity. Colonies conquered outside Europe supplied raw materials and precious metals, while kingdoms strengthened their economies by monopolizing routes and markets. Thus, trade ceased to be a local phenomenon and became global, connecting distant continents in an increasingly complex network. Maritime expansion not only generated wealth, but also accelerated the definitive end of feudalism. Land, which had been the foundation of wealth during the Middle Ages, lost importance in the face of new opportunities linked to trade and overseas exploration. The mercantile bourgeoisie became the leading force, financing expeditions and amassing fortunes that shifted the balance of power in Europe. Kings and merchants began to walk side by side, consolidating a world where monetary economy, the pursuit of profit, and competition among nations replaced the static and local logic of feuds. The Middle Ages slowly gave way to the modern age. During the Middle Ages, the Church was the greatest spiritual, political, and economic force in Europe. However, over time, its authority began to be questioned because of abuses, corruption, and its detachment from the needs of the people. The sale of indulgences, the accumulation of wealth, and its direct interference in secular matters provoked growing dissatisfaction. At the beginning of the 16th century, this discontent culminated in the Religious Reformation, a movement that profoundly shook the power of the Church and divided Western Christendom. Leaders such as Martin Luther in Germany and John Calvin in Switzerland defended radical changes, challenging traditional practices and dogmas, and preaching a return to the essence of the Christian faith. The Reformation was not only a religious phenomenon, but also a political and social one. By challenging papal authority, reformers opened the way for princes and kings to consolidate their independence from the Church. The rise of different branches of Christianity, such as Lutheranism and Calvinism, fragmented the religious unity that had sustained medieval Europe. This division gave rise to bloody conflicts, such as the wars of religion, but also drove profound changes in European thought, emphasizing the direct reading of the Bible, education, and a new work ethic. For feudalism, the Reformation represented yet another blow to its already weakened structure. The authority of the Church, which for centuries had legitimized the feudal system, was shaken, and many believers began to view spiritual power as something separate from traditional structures of domination. The Reformation, while weakening the central power of the Church, strengthened that of monarchies and rising cities, accelerating the transition to the modern age. Thus, the religious movement not only divided Christendom, but also contributed decisively to the collapse of the feudal order. Even after its decline, feudalism left deep marks that continued to shape Europe for centuries. Many social, political, and economic practices created in the Middle Ages survived and influenced the formation of modernity. The territorial organization based on rural properties, the idea of personal loyalty between rulers and the governed, and even the symbolic power of castles remained in the European imagination. The system of vassalage, though weakened, inspired later political relations, while the link between church and state consolidated during feudalism continued to influence public life. Thus, feudalism did not disappear abruptly. It transformed and adapted to new realities. In the economic sphere, feudalism bequeathed the valorization of land as a source of wealth, something that persisted even with the advancement of trade and monetary economy. In the cultural aspect, traditions, festivities, and peasant customs survived and continued to mark the identity of rural communities. Chivalric literature, epic songs, and Gothic architecture remained as symbols of an era in which the sacred and the military were intertwined. In popular imagination, the Middle Ages are still remembered as the time of knights, cathedrals, and unshakable faith, even though reality was much harsher and more unequal. Furthermore, the feudal legacy can be seen in the very formation of modern states. The decentralization of power during the Middle Ages taught the importance of negotiation among different social groups, while the experience of centralized monarchies, born from the feudal collapse, paved the way for new forms of government. The transition from feudalism to capitalism did not erase its marks but incorporated them into new structures. In this way, feudalism remains one of the most influential periods in history, not only for what it was, but for what it left as a legacy for the world that came afterward. Feudalism was much more than an economic system. It shaped all of medieval life, defining social, political, cultural, and spiritual relations. Over the centuries, feudal organization structured how people worked, believed, fought, and related to one another. The division of society into orders, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, became the basis of collective life, legitimized by the church and sustained by the military power of the nobility. Each individual knew their place within this hierarchy, and the functioning of society depended on this balance of dependencies and obligations. Castles, villages, monasteries, and cathedrals were concrete expressions of this order. The economy revolved around land, and agricultural production sustained not only peasants, but also the entire ruling elite. Constant wars, crusades, and sieges reinforced the centrality of violence and defense in the feudal world, while Christian faith gave meaning to suffering and ensured spiritual cohesion. Feudalism also shaped culture, inspiring literature, art, and even religious festivals, which followed the rhythm of seasons and harvests. Although it entered into crisis starting in the 14th century, feudalism left marks that surpassed its own time. It shaped mentalities, consolidated traditions, and influenced the foundations of centralized kingdoms that would later emerge. The way power was exercised, how the economy was organized, and how culture was expressed in the Middle Ages cannot be understood without understanding feudalism. It was feudalism that gave form to the era, defining its limits and its possibilities. That is why when we think of the Middle Ages, we inevitably think of feudalism, the system that structured an entire world. Although it disappeared as a political and economic system, feudalism left marks that still echo in the contemporary world. The idea of social hierarchy, of relationships based on reciprocal obligations, and of bonds of loyalty remains present in many structures of power. Expressions such as political fief or feudal relations are still used to describe situations in which power is concentrated in a few hands and exercised in a personal and decentralized way. This legacy shows how the medieval model continued to influence the way we think about authority, dependence, and power. In the cultural field, the feudal legacy is alive in the collective imagination. Castles, knights, ladies, and tournaments remain symbols of an era that, although harsh, still nourishes literature, cinema, and art today. Medieval romanticism, created by troubadours and epic songs, continues to inspire modern stories of adventure and fantasy. Furthermore, many popular festivals, rural customs, and religious traditions have direct roots in the Middle Ages, perpetuating an invisible link between past and present. In politics and economics, feudalism also left lasting lessons. The process of decentralization of power and the slow transition to monarchical centralization helped shape modern states. Likewise, the replacement of serfdom with free and wage labor paved the way for capitalism, showing how the transformation of the feudal system was fundamental for the formation of the current world. Thus, feudalism is not just a closed chapter of history, it is a foundation upon which many of the structures that still guide life in society were built. Feudalism may have come to an end centuries ago, but the medieval imagination remains alive today in popular culture. Imposing castles, armored knights, maidens, troubadours, and epic battles continue to populate books, films, series, and games, reinforcing the image of a Middle Ages marked by courage, honor, and religious mysticism. Many of these representations are idealized or romanticized, highlighting tournaments, banquets, and heroic deeds, but leaving in the background the harsh reality of peasant labor, hunger, and disease. Even so, they keep alive the fascination with a time when faith and the sword were intertwined in the construction of legendary worlds. Modern literature and cinema have turned the medieval legacy into an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Works of fantasy, such as those of J.R.R. Tolkien, created universes based on feudal structure, with kingdoms, castles, and battles against dark forces. Contemporary series explore political intrigue and the struggle for power in settings reminiscent of the games of vassalage of the Middle Ages. Electronic and board games also reproduce the medieval spirit, placing the player in the role of lords, warriors, or merchants. This cultural persistence shows how the feudal imagination transcended history and took on a life of its own in the collective memory. More than simple entertainment, these representations shape the way we see the past. Feudalism is often remembered not only as a social system, but as a world full of symbols, rituals, and images that arouse curiosity and admiration. Even when distorted through the lens of fantasy, it continues to dialogue with the present, offering a mirror of our own conflicts of power, faith, and survival. Thus, the medieval imagination remains a living cultural heritage, turning feudalism into one of the most remembered and reinvented periods in history. Feudalism was a system born out of collapse, shaped by necessity, and sustained by faith. For centuries, it structured medieval life around three fundamental elements: the power of the nobles, the faith of the church, and the survival of the peasants. Each layer of society lived in function of the other, united by bonds of loyalty and obligations that guaranteed stability in an unstable world. Life could be harsh, marked by hunger, wars, and epidemics, but it was also in this scenario that Gothic art, chivalric literature, religious traditions, and the first modern cities flourished. Feudalism was, therefore, a mechanism that, while limiting freedom, gave form to European identity. Looking at this period, we understand that power, faith, and survival were not choices, but inevitable conditions of medieval life. Kings depended on nobles, nobles depended on serfs, and all depended on the land and the promise of salvation. This fragile balance, sustained by violence and belief, allowed Europe to endure centuries of instability until it found paths of transformation. Feudalism came to an end, but it left lessons about human resilience in the face of adversity, about how social organization can be born from chaos, and about how faith can become a force of cohesion in times of uncertainty. We have reached the end of our journey through the Middle Ages and the universe of feudalism, a system that shaped the destiny of millions of people and left marks that still echo in the modern world. If you followed along until here, tell us in the comments, which part of this history caught your attention the most? Was it the hard life of the peasants, the crusades, the grandeur of the cathedrals, or the transformations that led to the end of feudalism?